Are Christians supposed to keep the Sabbath? You've probably been hit up more about this than anything.
It's been for over 40 years. Absolutely plagued by Seventh-day Adventists. 9 commandments is all you preach. You won't preach the one that's important to God.
So Ray Comfort and the Living Waters team tackle a question that they received from their audience, and one of you sent it to me. So we're going to go ahead and review some of the points that they make in this clip, and I'll give you my response. Now, Ray mentions that he gets this question a lot from Seventh-day Adventists, and I just want to make it clear that I'm not a Seventh-day Adventist. I don't endorse Ellen White. I'm just a follower of Christ who wants to do what he said by affirming even the least of the commandments in the law of God. That being said, the fact that Ray Comfort continually says things like this:
I'm going to give you a standard to judge your morality by, the biblical standard, the 10 commandments.
I think I'm a good person, yeah.
That's normal because you've got your own standard to judge by.
Yeah.
God gives his own standard, it's the 10 commandments. The law you should worry about is the moral law. The 10 commandments. The 10 commandments. Those 10 commandments for 10 commandments.
It has many people wondering why exactly he doesn't preach the commandment to remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy, when he continually tells both believers and unbelievers that the 10 commandments are God's moral law. Now, before I get into the breakdown, I just want to mention that I do have a massive amount of respect for Ray Comfort. He's a very gifted evangelist, and anybody who's ever watched his content knows exactly what I'm talking about. However, the fact that he's so influential is the exact reason why this issue needs to be addressed. And since this is the only video that I can find on the Whole Living Waters podcast channel that actually has the comment section turned off, it would appear to me that they know exactly how controversial their explanation is. And if you're a reasonable person, I think you'll see why when we hear their points. Let's get into it.
And I think there is some genuine confusion amongst some believers because they'll say, well, this is in the 10 Commandments. John MacArthur put it really well. The Sabbath is the only one of the 10 Commandments. It is non-moral and purely ceremonial.
I got a question. Says who? Why does it matter what John MacArthur decides isn't a moral issue? How does he even come to that conclusion? The fact that the scriptures tell us that God actually put people to death for violating this command, calls it an evil thing to break in Nehemiah, and rebukes the leaders of his people for actually turning a blind eye to it in Ezekiel, while never even once referring to the Sabbath day as a ceremonial law, gives me the impression that the scriptures do teach that this is truly a moral issue. So regardless of what John MacArthur or the Living Waters team teach, we need to make sure that we're forming our view of morality by what God says, not by man. I also can't help but ask why Ray doesn't pipe up and say, hey guys, I like John, but I don't really agree with what he's saying here. You know, the 10 Commandments, they're God's moral law. Nothing about it is ceremonial. I mean, that's what he says all the time, like we just seen from some of his videos. Let's continue.
And it was unique to the Old Covenant and to Israel.
No, it wasn't, because before the nation of Israel was even established, the Sabbath day was already set aside at Creation Week in Genesis chapter 2. But regardless, the nation of Israel was established so that they could be a light to the nations around them, so that the other nations would look at the commandments Israel kept and conclude that the God of heaven and earth was truly with them. And their reaction would be, what nation is there that has such laws and righteous judgments as this nation does? In other words, the nations around them would be drawn in by the wisdom of these commandments and join themselves to the Lord, and as a result, they would learn and practice these commandments as well, which would include the Sabbath day, as it says in Isaiah 56. Also the son of the foreigner who joined themselves to the Lord to serve him and to love the name of the Lord to be his servants. Everyone who keeps from defiling the Sabbath and holds fast my covenant, even them I will bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. And when we come to Christ, the scriptures actually teach us that we're no longer considered foreigners to God's people Israel, but fellow citizens. Which means that if the Sabbath day is only for Israel to keep, that would still include the follower of Christ.
The other 9 commandments, on the other hand, pertain to moral and spiritual absolutes and are repeated and expanded upon many places in the New Testament. But Sabbath observance is never recommended to Christians, much less given as a command in the New Testament.
Listen, even if that was true, the litmus test for whether or not a commandment applies to you and me as a follower of Christ is not contingent upon whether or not it's repeated in the New Testament. Now, if that was the litmus test, that would mean that Christians could now boil a young goat in its mother's milk, put on a dress if they're a man, man or even mate with an animal, because none of these laws are actually specifically mentioned in the New Testament. But not only does Jesus tell his disciples to pray that the event surrounding the abomination of desolation doesn't take place on the Sabbath day, which everyone understands to be an event that occurs at least after the death, resurrection, and ascension of Christ, but it's also recorded in Acts 15 that the expectation of the apostles was that new believers would be in the synagogues on the Sabbath day, hearing the law of Moses so that they could continue to grow in discipleship. So to say that the Sabbath day isn't repeated in the New Testament is an erroneous statement.
Also, when Jesus spoke to the rich young ruler that ran to him, he didn't use the Sabbath commandment to bring the knowledge of sin. He named 5 commandments, but he didn't use the Sabbath. And I believe there's a reason for that. The commandments he pointed to are recognizable as sin by a natural mind. Shall not steal, shall not lie, shall not commit adultery, shall not kill. But he didn't say Sabbath. Why? Because the Sabbath isn't clearly recognizable as a sin by the carnal mind.
Jesus also didn't bring up the first 2 commandments, which pertain to idolatry, or the 3rd commandment, which pertains to blasphemy. And yet, Ray will bring up these commandments to an unbeliever to show them that they've sinned before God. In other words, the commandments that Jesus references in his exchange with the rich young ruler aren't an exhaustive list of laws that expose sin. And I'm pretty sure Ray would agree with that, so I'm not exactly sure why he's bringing up this encounter as a reason for why he doesn't confront people about the Sabbath day. And as far as his argument goes about the Sabbath day not being recognizable by the natural mind, I would argue that if you ask just about anybody what they thought about an employer making their employees work 7 days a week without a single day off, they would agree that's not right. We all need a break. It's not healthy to live that way, which the Living Waters team will actually agree with later on in this video. And not only that, but ask anyone what they think about a wife who plans a night out for dinner with her husband, but instead he decides to go on a golfing trip with the boys, only to call her later with the excuse that, in his natural mind, he didn't realize he'd done anything wrong. I'm pretty sure his wife is going to think he's out of his mind, because it shouldn't take 2 years of Bible college to know he's just made a big mistake. If my wife sets aside a day for us to put everything else aside and prioritize time, I should honor that. How much more should we show our love and devotion to the one who gave us life by honoring the day he set aside, which is the 7th day? It should stir conviction in our hearts when we understand this. But the problem is we can end up searing our conscience in regards to certain commandments when we continually convince ourselves that it's just not that big of a deal. Now, another thing that I find to be inconsistent about Ray's point here concerning this commandment is that, as we just heard in this podcast, he says he doesn't use the 4th commandment out of the 10 to show someone they've sinned before God. However, in a sermon titled 10 Canons of God's Law he preached a long time ago, he actually goes through every single one of the 10 commandments one by one and explains how Christians can use every single one of these commandments to show the lost that they've violated God's holy law. Listen closely to what he says about it and see if it's consistent with what he says today.
The Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. 4th commandment, remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. Man, I went for 22 years violating the Sabbath. I didn't know I was supposed to keep the Sabbath holy. The work of the Lord was written in my heart. I knew God should be first. I knew I should esteem my Creator, but I was a rebel walking in rebellion. I said, I didn't keep the Sabbath holy. I didn't set aside one day in 7 to rest my body and to worship God in spirit and in truth.
See, when he goes through the 10 commandments in the sermon, why didn't he stop at the 4th one and say, oh, the 4th commandment? Well, I don't use that one to show the knowledge of sin to a rebel because they won't recognize it as sin. And ultimately, when they become a Christian, they'll realize that this law was ceremonial, like John MacArthur says, and Jesus is now our Sabbath rest. So we shouldn't judge anyone for not observing this one, which is where this conversation actually leads to, because the next verse that's brought up in this video is Colossians 2:16. Now, I have a video dedicated to dealing with this verse that I think you'll find to be very simple and consistent with the entirety of Scripture that I'll leave on the screen that you can click on. So if you're interested and you haven't watched it yet, I'd recommend watching that before we get into part 2, because this is the scripture that the Living Waters team brings up in order to start laying this foundation for why Jesus is our Sabbath rest and why we shouldn't judge others by what the law of God says anymore. That'll be next. So stick around because there's a lot more to address here.
If you and I follow in the footsteps of Jesus, and when we approach an impenitent sinner, we open up the 10 commandments and show them they have violated God's law, that they have done something extremely wrong,